Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I stand to speak to the dairy industry restructuring bill, the sunset clauses, or rather movement of the goalpost bill. Because what this bill does is it requires Fonterra to supply subsidised milk to its competitors, but it changes the goalpost. Previously, Fonterra would have actually had to stop providing subsidised milk to its competitors sooner, but now we're going to delay so that Fonterra will have to continue to provide subsidised milk to its competitors, its overseas owned competitors in particular, for a longer period. Mr Speaker, the background to why this bill, there are many reasons why this bill is flawed. I mean, you could start with the obvious one. Why are we making a New Zealand-owned producers cooperative subsidise its foreign-owned competitors so that they can compete against it in the foreign markets? An absurd proposition. Unbelievably, this House is voting for this absurd bill. But if you like, the background as to why this bill is particularly ill-timed is what's happening in commodity prices. Over the last 100 years, commodity prices dropped very dramatically, about 1.5% a year across all commodities, looking at food and iron ore and minerals. 1.5% a year, or 1.2% a year. But in the last 7 to 10 years, all of that century of drop in the value of commodities has been wiped out because commodities have increased dramatically in value right across the board in the last 10 years. And so a century of slow decline in the value of commodities has been reversed in the course of a decade. And against that backdrop, it means that those who produce commodities, whether that be milk powder or whether it be iron ore, are suddenly have the assets that produce those commodities suddenly become much more valuable than they were previously. So in Australia, of course, we've seen the massive boom in Western Australia linked to iron ore in particular, but not only iron ore. And in New Zealand, we've seen the boom around land value, land prices. Land which has access to water to produce dairy solids and dairy protein has become much, much more valuable as we've seen this dramatic reversal. Some of the hedge funds in describing the current situation talk about a paradigm shift, that there has been a complete paradigm shift, that after a century of slowly declining commodity prices, we've suddenly seen this dramatic reversal. And of course the reason for the reversal is because the planet's finite. I mean, it's pretty simple. What we found is that there's a big increase in demand coming out of coming out of China and India in particular, and there's limited capacity to supply that demand because, of course, there's not more agricultural land with access to water being created, nor is there more iron ore mines being created, nor is there more oil being created. It's a finite resource. So in the context of that, we've seen this big spike in prices. Now, one of the outcomes of that is that those who want access to those resources, which have become very expensive, of course are looking as to how they can secure their supply chains. And New Zealand is part of the global supply chain for food protein, in particular dairy protein. And so we've seen a lot of overseas interest in buying up New Zealand land, New Zealand processing facilities, and also New Zealand agricultural services companies. We've seen the loss of PGG Wrightson just recently, and with its very valuable seed stocks, and other agricultural service companies have become a target for overseas buyout. So as the value of these commodities has increased dramatically, we've seen a much greater overseas interest in buying up New Zealand land, processing facilities and the supply chains that all go with it. What this means is that the context for the Dairy Industry Restructuring Act, when it was originally passed, has dramatically changed. It is no longer the same world that it was when the Act was first put in place. So when people come to look at the situation, they treat it as if nothing has changed, but of course everything has changed. And it means that no longer do these regulations ensure that we have a competitive domestic raw milk market in New Zealand. They do no such thing. They're not designed anymore to do well, they may be designed to it, but that's not really what they're doing anymore. What they're doing now is they're supplying raw milk to the overseas-owned competitors of Fonterra, because raw milk and the dairy protein that comes out of it is incredibly valuable. Now, the Green Party is a very strong believer in New Zealand production, so we're very keen to make sure that raw milk is provided at a competitive price to New Zealand-owned producers based in New Zealand. We want to support New Zealand industry. We want to make sure that the New Zealand raw milk market is competitive and that milk in that market is at a competitive price. And if these regulations were restricted to simply providing raw milk to New Zealand producers, whether it be New Zealand-owned producers even exporting or whether it be just for the domestic market, then we would be supportive. But what these regulations do is ensure that raw milk is provided at effectively a subsidised price to the overseas-owned competitors of Fonterra, who then transform that raw milk into the products, mostly milk powder but not only, which then compete against Fonterra in Fonterra's overseas markets. This is what's changed between the original Dairy Industry Restructuring Act and this bill that we're looking at the moment. And the problem is that people haven't realised that the world is no longer the same, and so they're treating the dairy market as if it used to be. Sometimes I think it's like, because part of what stands behind this is we don't want to upset our trading partners. Part of the regulation of the New Zealand dairy sector is to make sure that we don't upset our trading partners and don't attract any kind of WTO trade action, WTO action because of uncompetitive practices within our domestic dairy market. And so these provisions are in place in order to try to knock that aside, any attempts to challenge the regulations governing the New Zealand dairy market. But of course what's happened is that in the past, because New Zealand was promoting relatively cheap commodities, it was in our interest to try to break down trade barriers all around the world in order to get those commodities into those markets. But now the exact opposite thing is happening. Those markets are desperate for New Zealand dairy products. The Chinese are not consuming a lot more of New Zealand dairy produce because of our free trade agreement with China. They're consuming a lot more of our dairy produce because they need it, because it is clean, safe, particularly safe after the scandal there, and because they need access to the food protein. And globally, what we're seeing is that food protein has got in shorter and shorter supplies, more and more valuable, and those markets where previously we were trying to overcome barriers to get our food in there, actually they're desperate for our food and they really want our food. So the whole global context has changed. It's kind of like saying back in the 50s or the 40s or even the 60s that if you looked at the oil market, countries all around the planet wanted oil. They were desperate for oil. The problem with oil wasn't that there was a trade barrier to oil. People were buying oil because they really needed oil. Now, other commodities are now becoming more and more like oil because we have a global shortage of those kind of food commodities. Other countries really want New Zealand primary produce. And that is one of the fundamental things that's changed. So the concern that we have to let overseas companies buy up our land, let overseas companies buy up our processing facilities, have these regulations in place, all of which are designed to stop any WTO action against New Zealand, all of which is designed to maintain a multilateral trading environment in which we can get our goods into those markets, has been turned on its head. Because now those markets are desperate for our goods. So orienting our entire dairy industry regulations around the concept of trying to avoid WTO litigation by making sure we sell off our land to overseas owners without breaking our WTO commitments, making sure we allow Synlait to be bought up by overseas owners and have these dairy industry regulations in place so that we don't upset our WTO commitments, all of that's been turned on its head. Because actually now we are in a powerful position because we have access to something that people want. And in fact, what we should be doing is looking after that valuable thing. We should be preventing the overseas overseas buy-up of our land, preventing the overseas buy-up of our processing facilities and our agricultural servicing companies. We should be protecting Fonterra and not making it subsidise its foreign-owned competitors in New Zealand through the Dairy Industry Restructuring Act and the amendments that are before us now. It is by understanding how the world has changed in the last decade that you can understand how fundamentally ill-conceived this particular Amendment Act is and how fundamentally ill-conceived the framework to the dairy industry in New Zealand is at the moment. Mr Speaker, the Green Party will not be supporting this bill.